This video is brought to you by Imprint. In the mid-late 20th century, South Korea experienced a period of astronomical growth. In just 3 decades, it went from one of the world's poorest developing countries to an industrialized, high-income economy, in a process that's been nicknamed the Miracle on the Han River. But today, while South Korea is the world's 6th biggest exporter and 13th largest economy overall, GDP growth has stagnated, and various structural problems have emerged, leading some commentators to question whether South Korea's economic miracle is finally coming to an end. So in this video, we'll take a look at South Korea's economic development, why it stagnated over the last decade, and whether things can improve. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. But first, let's look at some context. When South Korea was a Japanese colony between 1910 and 1945, it was unimaginably poor. Its economy was based on subsistence agriculture, and Koreans had a life expectancy of just 37 years, compared to around 60 in the US. After the Second World War, the country was divided into South Korea and North Korea. But in 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, which led to the start of the 3-year Korean War, which further devastated South Korea's economy. For the next decade, South Korea relied heavily on imports and foreign aid to keep itself going, and in the early 1960s, per capita income in South Korea was lower than that of Haiti, Ethiopia, and Yemen, with over 40% of the population suffering from absolute poverty. However, things changed in the 1960s, when South Korea experienced 2 periods of major economic growth by shifting to an export-led growth model. In 1961, General Park Chung-hee seized power in a military coup and extended government control over the country's financial system, nationalising the banks and introducing agrarian reforms. He also pursued a protectionist economic policy through a series of largely successful 5-year plans designed to develop exporting industries. Over the 60s and 70s, the country shifted from basic goods to petrochemicals and heavy industry, and then in the 80s and 90s it moved to high-tech products and electronics. In the 1970s, South Korea enjoyed an average annual growth rate of over 10%, which fell to a still incredible 8.6% in the 80s. One of the key elements in Hee's strategy of guided capitalism were South Korea's conglomerates, like Hyundai, Samsung, and LG, known as the chaebol, which the state supported via tax breaks, government contracts, and cheap loans. This strategy was super successful, and the chaebol had become financially independent by the late 80s. By the mid-90s, South Korea had a thriving economy, with absolute poverty levels at just 3.4%, and in 1996, GDP per capita was more than $13,000, a similar figure to Portugal and Spain. Unfortunately, South Korea's economy has since slowed. When the Asian financial crisis struck in 1997, it exposed several structural weaknesses in the country's financial system, specifically an over-leveraged corporate sector and an over-reliance on exports, which still haven't fully been fixed. After 1997, at least 11 of the 30 largest chaebol went bust, bringing South Korea to the brink of bankruptcy, and it had to be bailed out by the IMF. Afterwards, the government implemented a number of neoliberal reforms which helped the economy bounce back remarkably quickly. But its key vulnerabilities, i.e. a high leverage ratio and an over-reliance on exports, have persisted. On top of that, South Korea is now also dealing with an aging population, a slowdown in demand for exports, and rising competition from China, which will probably keep it stuck in this economic pickle for a while. So let's take a look at each of those issues in turn, starting with South Korea's aging population. As you might know from our previous videos, South Korea has a severe demographic crisis, with its fertility rate of 0.68 being the lowest in the world, and by the 2050s, Korea will have one of the oldest populations in the OECD. South Korea's old age dependency ratio, which is the number of people aged 65 and over compared to the number of working age people, is projected to quadruple in the coming decades, which will place extra strain on public services like healthcare and pensions. Moreover, a smaller, older labour force is unlikely to generate the same innovation and productivity rates that we've seen in the past. The next problem is South Korea's over-reliance on exports, which is in part because the economy is too reliant on the chaebol. While they played a key role in developing South Korea's post-war economy, they rely heavily on exports, which have declined thanks to a combination of a rise in global protectionism, a slowing global economy, and renewed international competition, especially from China. South Korea's smaller companies, which generally focus more on the domestic economy and employ more than 80% of the country's workforce, can't replace the shortfall, largely because they're significantly less productive. South Korea hasn't managed to innovate at the same levels it did before either. And between 2005 and 2022, only one new sector, displays, entered South Korea's list of top 10 export products. Now, this brings us on to the final issue, which is rising competition from China. Initially, the early 21st century saw a boom in South Korean tech exports to China, which was the single biggest contributor to South Korea's growing exports and trade surplus. This continued after the 2008 financial crisis too, as Chinese stimulus measures drove the export share of GDP in South Korea up to its peak of 54% in 2011, roughly double that of even export-heavy countries like China. However, since then, China has strived to become self-sufficient, especially since Xi announced his Made in China policy in 2015. This means that Korean exports to China have taken a massive hit in recent years, and in 2023, South Korea exported more goods to the US and Japan combined than to China, for the first time in almost 2 decades. All in all, South Korea's growth rate has slowed to an average of about 2% for the past few years, and is projected to slump to just 0.5% in 2050. This probably underestimates the severity of the crisis as well, because these forecasts were made before the most recent demographic data was published. So, can South Korea get out of its slump? Well, obviously no one knows for sure, but South Korea is starting to look quite a lot like Japan. It's an aging East Asian economy with a property crisis, a historic over-reliance on exports, and debt issues, with now a very similar GDP per capita. Unfortunately for South Korea, Japan has been trying and failing to get out of its economic funk for 30 years now. Understanding these kinds of economic theories are difficult, and honestly, even politicians don't always seem to understand them. So maybe they could do with checking out the lesson How Governments Fight Inflation on Imprint. Just like TLDR, Imprint is all about turning complex books and topics into something you can learn quickly, conveniently, and visually. It's super quick, with most lessons taking less than 2 minutes to complete, summarising knowledge from all kinds of topics, using Harvard professors and best-selling authors to teach you key concepts. It's also convenient because it's all housed in their easy-to-use mobile app, letting you replace doom scrolling while waiting for your train or coffee with actual learning. And it's visual because, well, just look at their app. If you've not used it before, you've likely never seen anything quite like it. Unlike traditional books, their animated explanations help you stay focused, understand concepts quickly, and actually retain what you learn. So join the millions of users learning with Imprint, including me. I'm taking their course called Essential Philosophy Theories and Thinkers, and you can do that too by using the link in the description. Plus, if you use that link, you'll get a free 7-day trial and get 20% off an annual plan when you sign up. Plus, they'll know that you came from us. So check it out, support the channel, and thanks for watching TLDR.